All right, you're live.
All right. Cold open Saturday on the Blunt Force Conservative podcast. Appreciate you guys tuning in. This will be saved as a recording here on X. We're also simulcasting on YouTube, so you can always go back and catch us there. Please hit that like and subscribe button so that you will be notified anytime we jump online. Sometimes we may jump online in the middle of the week, if depending on some things that we may want to comment on. Want to give you a little insight as what's been going on with me. I really haven't been on social media that much this past week. Texted a couple of friends back and forth, but I was down in Tampa, Florida, Monday and Tuesday. And Mr. Producer, if you'll pull up that first slide, this this young lady right here, Jenna Persons Malika, she is a state representative down in Florida, and a mutual friend put us in touch with each other, and she was holding a panel dealing with foreign threats to the state of Florida, but it actually dovetailed into threats that many other states are seeing. It was a great time, a great turnout. We did some game planning the night before at dinner, and then we had a panel of about 8 of us on Tuesday morning at the Oxford Exchange in Tampa, Florida. And present at that were Jenna, a couple of state representatives, state senators, also some representatives of some nonprofits that bring intelligence and information to the state to combat the foreign threats. And we also had the state attorney general as part of the panel. And it was a really good turnout. It was videotaped. There were press there. I did a little interview afterward. I'll let you know. I'll put something out online once I get a copy of the video, once Jenna sends it to me. But Jenna is somebody I'd recommend that you follow. Florida really is taking the lead among the states in attacking a lot of this stuff. It's very difficult in federal government to be able to. It's almost like turning a battleship around to get the government to actually go in and act. And I'm happy to see states like Florida taking an aggressive stance at dealing with foreign threats within their own state. They're actually leading the way. And I see a lot of other states starting to benchmark off of what Florida did. It was a great discussion, and we're going to get into that a little bit here on online. The guest I've got on today, he was on the very first podcast of Blunt Force Conservative, and that's Gary Heasley. Gary is one of the co-hosts of the Conservative Voice on WWDB out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He and Ada Nestor have become really good friends of mine. Gary is not by name on X, so if you really want to get a message to Gary, follow the Conservative Voice here on X, and send him a message. Something that Gary and I are going to talk about is some notoriety that Ada Nestor has gotten. I tried to get Ada on for this Saturday, but she's got her priorities right. Her son is in a football scrimmage today. They've got family things going on. She's just had a lot going on. But one of the things that she had going on was dealing with the malfeasance that's up in DC and affecting the United States. Here's her latest post dealing with some of that. Ada has a great Substack page that I highly recommend that you follow. It was voted, I think, out of all of the political Substacks that are out there, I think she was in the top 55 of political Substacks, and that's quite an accomplishment. So much so that it got the attention of this individual here that you may know, which would be Donald Trump. And Donald truthed, I guess over on Truth Social, truthed Ada's research, her analysis, thought highly of it, and put it out. It was about at midnight, and I get a phone ding, and it woke me up. And I look over and I see this thing that happened to Ada, where she was brought into the public eye more than I think she was planning on at that time. But it is interesting that Donald Trump knows who Ada Nestor is, and you should too. So with that, let's go to our guest today, Mr. Producer, and let's bring in Gary Heasley. Gary is, if you look in the background, we were talking about this. He's broadcasting. You're in Brazil, right? This is your your summer home in Brazil to
Right.
escape Pennsylvania.
Yeah, actually, yeah, just in the countryside of Pennsylvania. Yep.
Well, Gary, let's real quick. Let's talk about Ada. What was were you as pleasantly surprised as I was when that happened? I think it happened at like midnight.
Well, Ada's been at this a long time. She's been doing deep research on a lot of topics for years now, and she's had a pretty persistent social media presence for a long time. Now she got, um, you know, attacked, let's say, when she ran for school board, and people would come after her social media. And at one point, she sort of stopped, and then launched a new account and went back in. So I'm not surprised because she's been so persistent, and her traction on social media has been consistently growing. But this new level that she's hit is because she's now taken that work that she does and put it into a Substack page, Ada Nestor WC at Substack, and she's just doing great work. So I was surprised that it got all the way to Donald Trump, because there are only a handful that actually get to do that. And yeah, she ended up getting to that number 52, 55 in political commentary. So she's really getting traction, but it's because she's doing great work.
Yeah, I really I like the way that she handles herself. Both of you, the way that you handle yourselves is so professional on the conservative voice. And I told Ada kind of tongue in cheek, I said, you've got that NPR, host voice
Yeah.
type thing when you're talking. This just seems to be just, you're kind of, it's just mellow and you're listening to what she has to say. But she is really smart. And a lot of people that don't know her don't realize that she wasn't always conservative. She wasn't always, I guess people would say, leaning toward the right. She just came to realization with her analysis and looking into things. And I got the impression things just weren't adding up, and she started asking more and more questions. And I don't think she's changed her opinions. I think she realized that her opinions were probably, in analysis, was probably more closely aligned with the conservative views. What are you've known her longer than I have. What are your thoughts on her
Well,
move?
when you look at the people that we have co-hosting on the conservative voice, I think about half are long time conservative or Republican at least, and half are people who had that awakening. And when I think about the broader community that we spend time with, at least half were Democrats before 2016 and 2020. But over time, as they heard either, in some cases, President Trump's message, or as they saw things happening at their children's school, that was a big one, or as they looked at the election in 2020 and saw that it clearly wasn't right, that they saw that was stolen, um, people just began to question what was happening. And if you track that awakening against the decline in a poll that Gallup does that shows trust in corporate media, you can track that awakening just as people began to question this constant flood of propaganda they were getting. So Ada, like some others that we know, yeah, she was not necessarily a conservative by brand and by loyalty to party or candidates. She was, like I think a lot of folks, a Democrat effectively, but she wasn't necessarily deeply indoctrinated. And yeah, she went through that process, looking around, looking at research, looking at what was happening in the schools and saying, that can't possibly be right. And then Donald Trump, the guy who really is the bridge. And this is something we spent a lot of time talking about lately because we think this is something that the party is not understanding. He is the bridge that took the Republican brand and brought into it independents who are far more conservative than the Republican Party, but are disgusted with the party. Um, People in the urban markets who had been basically captured by Democrats, many of them not voting, totally disengaged because they saw that they just lived in this corrupt machine and there was nothing they could do about it. And then these folks like Ada and some others that we know who were, either really active Democrats or just sort of moderate Democrats who have completely flipped their script and changed to being not just a conservative voter in many cases, but like Ada, they're conservative activists. What's what's kind of remarkable is that some of them joined the Republican Party, became committee members, got very active, and then left the Republican Party because it's not conservative. So, um, it's been interesting to watch this. But I will tell you, if I didn't associate with former Democrats, I would be spending an awful lot of time alone. So,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I've kind of had that same move. I was never a Democrat. My dad raised me well. My grandfather was an FDR Democrat,
Uh,
and those individuals are hard to get changed because they looked at what was happening during World War II, but they don't see it from the perspective that we see it. Where I look
right.
back and I realize that FDR is probably one of the worst presidents that we had. That he extended the war. He extended the war, and he did so because it gave him the ability to exercise other power. We have some kids in school. You were talking about with the school boards. We have some kids in school that don't realize that have no knowledge of the internment camps, where he was just rounding up people that were Japanese and putting them
Right.
in cages. So you brought up the thing about school boards with Ada and her awakening. It was similar. I want to get to that in a minute. So my awakening on the Republican Party happened under George W. Bush. I was a huge Reagan supporter. It was the first president that I got to vote for. I just missed the cutoff of voting for him in 1980. I did vote for him in 1984,
Hmm.
and I went along and voted for, uh, you know, the senior George W. Bush. Looking back, I wish I had come to that realization a little earlier about the Republican Party and started asking some questions. But the questions I asked really happened under the George GWB under Bush the second
Yeah.
when he was president. And I remember specifically the two words that made me start questioning things, and that was compassionate conservative. And that dovetailed into what I now know was George W. Bush's support for open borders and illegal immigration.
Yes.
It it really opened my eyes to it. I started asking questions about it when I would get the cold calls from the Republican Party. Hey, would you support us? Would you send some money? And I would start asking questions. How quickly they got off the phone. They didn't want to be challenged.
No.
I was never a supporter of McCain nor Romney. I thought that they would that would have been horrific for the Republican Party, for the country, to have Romney uh, go in there as president and Paul Ryan as the vice president. I just think it would have been a terrible thing. We would have been set back. But I love how Trump has taken the Reagan coalition and put it on steroids and brought it into this MAGA movement. I think Reagan is probably smiling from heaven, looking down on this. Finally, somebody gets it because he had his own awakening from the Democrat Party moving to the Republican Party. Now, I know a lot of Democrats, especially here in Mississippi, that took on the moniker of being a Republican, but they did so just to protect their political future. It wasn't because of their belief in the Constitution and all that. But getting back to the school boards,
Hmm.
one of the things we brought up in Tampa, or I brought up, and then it really, I felt like it was a compliment when the Attorney General for the state of Florida benchmarked off of it and their state and local representatives benchmarked off of it, something we don't see here in Mississippi. And I'll be interested in what you see up in Pennsylvania. But I said, if you really want to take back this country, you've got to get back to doing what the left did. The left indoctrinated our schools beginning in the 60s and started turning hearts and minds. And then they became the educators, the ones that were indoctrinated in the 60s. And it built over time of taking over the hearts and minds of the students. You've got to get back into the schools and teach the students about what it means to be an American, the fabric of the American society, the melting pot, what the Constitution means and what its purpose is and how it applies to your everyday life, the
Yeah.
dangers of having a government regulating every portion of your life. And they benchmarked off of that with some of the questions that they were getting and the answers, and they kept referring back to it. And it really made me feel good. I don't see a lot of our state and local representatives here in Mississippi, and I definitely don't see them on the federal level. When we were battling the school boards with the COVID policies and the pornographic books in our schools, we couldn't get them. They might talk to us behind the scenes, but we couldn't get them to speak out. What's it like up in Pennsylvania?
So, um, you know, when you say, do you want to take back the country? the truth is, many of the components of the Republican Party seem to be quite comfortable with where the Democrats were taking the country, right? We didn't see, for example, big fights over the deficit spending from the party that called itself fiscal conservative. We didn't see any fights over government overreach with things like civil forfeiture and the rules that make every bank teller a federal agent spying on you, right? They don't fight those things. They in the big expensive bill they put in trillions of dollars of spending. Now they say, well, we can't eliminate it. Oh, okay, maybe not. Where are the rescission bills? And when the parliamentarian marches out and waves a pen and says, "Oh, you can't do something," they just surrender. The truth is, you look at somebody like John Thune, a Republican leader, his Liberty score is F. You say, well, you can't really go by those scores. No, you can't, but they're an indicator. And then look at his behavior. Both him and Spender Johnson keeping the House and the Senate open throughout the recess so that Donald Trump can't do recess appointments of his nominees. So the truth is, I don't think that a large part of the Republican Party, specifically that has relationships either with the deep state or with deep pockets, I don't think they particularly care about the policies that have been in place. They haven't done anything to fight them. And now that we've given them for the second time, the House, the Senate, and the White House, they're doing the bare minimum to implement the American agenda. So we really have a tale of two parties here, maybe three. You know, you've got those opportunists who have been elected to office or who are in party leadership roles who really just want to run it as a business. They were happy with John McCain as a presidential candidate because they raised huge amounts of money. They passed it around to themselves. Didn't seem to ever be really any strategy to win or any likelihood of winning. Never could understand why they picked him as a candidate, given his record and the way what he was focused on. But the party got behind him solidly and did that, I thought, with no real passion about winning. So I don't think that the Republican Party, is in a position where it wants to change the things you're talking about with the educators in the schools. Where's the national party screaming about pornography in the schools? They're not. The consultants tell local candidates, whatever you do, don't talk about pornography in the schools because that'll make the lunatics angry at you. Now, Ada's an example with some other people we know who ran for school board and ran against the idea that we should have pornography in the school and those other policies that were been implemented in our school systems. The party didn't pick up that banner. The big donors didn't get behind it. These were people that were out there by themselves fighting because they care about policy. So you've got the opportunists, you've got then the brand loyal Republican, those that say every R is better than any D. And, I said this yesterday on the radio show, no matter what the Republican person, a senator or representative does, it's good because they're Republican. We have to back them. That's the brand loyalty, the people that think of politics like it's a sport. Well, he's got my jersey, I've got to back him. She's got my jersey, I've got to back her. Those aren't particularly hard-thinking people. And then you've got a large base of people that include former Democrats, hardcore conservatives, people that are the moderates but are policy focused. When I say moderate, their demands are simple. We want our Constitution restored. We want the Fourth Amendment in full force. We want a fiscal approach that is reasonable. We don't want $2 trillion deficits. We want lower taxes and lower spending, which is anathema to these Republicans. So you've got this party split into three elements, as far as I can tell. Unfortunately, a lot of the power in the parties in the hands of the opportunists, again, they're ideologically much closer to the Democrats because they don't do anything to fight the Democrats. They'll hold some House hearings and get some Fox News segments and a few talking points. But they aren't really at war with the folks that are destroying our nation and Western civilization as a whole. It really comes down to that ideological branch of the party, which is made up, again, it's even people that aren't Republicans who voted for Donald Trump, these very conservative independents, people who were Democrats and then realized that party has become, an enemy of the nation and of our culture. And then the hardcore long-term conservative. And that's a divide that we're struggling with all the time. So coming back, what do? I think you're right. You've got to get the education system squared away. That means eliminating the Department of Education, not trying to transform it. You can track the destruction of our schools exactly correlating to the increase in power and budget of the Department of Education. As that department got bigger, our schools became less competitive and then dysfunctional. So what is the argument that we need a Department of Education? Just to pass out money and issue edicts through Dear Colleague letters? This should be a major focus of the entire Republican caucus in the Congress, is getting rid of the Department of Education. They should be backing Trump on that and making that happen. So I think that's a problem. Now, there is a bright spot in all this, which of course is the Freedom Caucus. Pennsylvania has one of the largest state level freedom caucuses in the country. Mississippi has one as well. They have a freedom caucus. There were 22 members in the Pennsylvania Freedom Caucus. Those are House members in the PA state legislature who really do lean into the fight. Now, I will tell you, some of them are leaning a little less into the fight as they get more opportunities to become part of leadership in the House or to be embraced more by the party. It also turns out the more people cuddle up with the party, the more they have to give up the fight to address the issues. So this Freedom Caucus, though, both at the federal level and at the state level, is the only group of hardcore ideological conservatives who I see actually willing to go to war over education, fiscal issues, corruption, fighting this green lunacy. That's where I think we have to organize our efforts and support, is around them so that they begin to speak with a louder voice.
Yeah, I was taking some notes here. We were talking about the school board. One of the things that we found effective, and we actually didn't have to implement it. We threatened to implement it when we got the COVID policies rescinded, and we got them to start looking into the obscene and objectionable materials that were being put into the schools, and that was with surety bonds. I was surprised before we even sent a letter that we were looking into surety bonds. We just started asking for, hey, we need a copy of your surety bond. We need a copy of your oath of office. And people, I think a lot of people don't understand that you have to be bonded to be in that office. You have to be ensured that you're going to uphold your constitutional oath. And if you can't get bonded, you cannot be in that office. Now, I don't know how that works at the federal level, but all I know is once we started asking the questions, I was already getting certified mail from insurance adjusters and providers for those bonds coming to my house saying, hey, we've looked at your assertions about our client, and we don't think that it meets the criteria. And I'm like, well, I haven't sent you anything, so I don't know what you're looking at. And then what we did was I spelled out, and I wrote it just like I was going to write an affidavit for a criminal act. I spelled out chapter and verse how they were violating their oath, violating the Constitution, violating the law, violating stare decisis decisions from the Supreme Court. And I spelled that out chapter and verse with cites and examples. And the only thing that we did was we just sent that with a letter that said, this is our notice of intent to file. If you continue this path, we're going to file this. And more often than not, what we learned is if there is an investigation into looking into their oath and did they violate that bond, during that time, other bonding companies will not give them coverage. So that really worked for us. Now, the other thing you were talking about, the Freedom Caucus, I don't know how effective they are up in Pennsylvania. When I first got introduced to them here after I retired back in 2019, I took a look at their history and I looked at where they are now and where they were before. And there were like 6 members in 2019. And I think there's like 6 members today. So their coalition is not growing down here.
No.
I don't know if it's just the messaging or what, or just the mere fact that it's an example of what I tell people. They see Mississippi as, MAGA country and all that. And we are strong supporters of Donald Trump, but we're not a red state. We're a purple state. If you look at our Liberty scores of our politicians and scoring of legislation, we're about 52 to 57% conservative.
Yeah.
Our two senators are in, Roger Wicker's in the high 40s, low 50s on his conservative scores. Cindy Hyde Smith is in the low to mid 50s on her conservative scores. And then we've got the one Democrat representative in Benny Thompson.
Uh-huh.
And with the redistricting, and this is going to dovetail into where I want to ask you some things about what's going on in Texas. Um, they seem to be constantly giving him more area of Mississippi. So we have four representatives in the state of Mississippi. I-55 runs right up the middle of Mississippi. On the left side, the entire left side, and they just added a couple of counties to Benny Thompson. That's all Benny Thompson country. To the right, the other three have to divide that up. And I know from my civics teaching that when they talk about this gerrymandering and all this, my sister called asking me to explain gerrymandering.
Ah,
I said, the way that the allocation of seats is supposed to be is only supposed to be based on population. It's not supposed to be based on ideology. It's not supposed to be based on, any other immutable characteristics, like race or creed or gender or anything like that. But what ends up happening is they figure out that, okay, if you've got 80% Republican leaning in one county and you've got 100% in a Democrat county, I said what they're willing to do is give up a little bit of that Democrat county to branch it into the Republican county and then pull those numbers down.
right.
And that's where the gerrymandering takes place. So twofold on there. Let's tell me about the Freedom Caucus in Pennsylvania. Has it been successful? Is it a growing group? Are they being effective? What are you seeing up there?
Well, just touching back on your point about states like Mississippi and Alabama and these states that are supposed to be so conservative. Roger Wickers, your senator, has an F Liberty score, 50%. That means 50% of the time he votes in a conservative way and consistent with the Constitution, and 50% of the time he votes as a leftist. And I don't think that average citizens understand the degree to which the states that are supposed to be considered so conservative, or areas that are so conservative, are represented by people like him who really don't reflect either they don't reflect the actual thinking of their citizens, or we're misunderstanding what that community really is. This guy's not a conservative, and but he's probably been pretty safe. Um, your Benny Thompson gets an ACLU score of 100%. So he's as radical as he could be. He also comes out of Mississippi. So there is a messaging problem in all of the states. And the messaging problem is, for example, on issues like abortion. We did a very powerful segment on abortion on the Conservative Voice, because our premise is you can't simply ignore that issue and continue to lose elections because of it, because you're afraid you're going to anger the radical lunatics. What happens when you stop talking about these important issues is that Overton window we've all been talking about for the last 30 years, that Overton window keeps moving until what was once moderate is now some radical ideology. For example, wanting the Constitution restored, wanting fiscal conservatism, a balanced budget, lower taxes. That's now considered radical. And a Roger Wicker, who is voting with the leftist half the time, is probably considered moderate. He's not. He's in fact the radical. So this messaging is a problem. And then you come to the Freedom Caucus. So there's a penalty for being part of a Freedom Caucus. As a legislator, you get the talk from the party telling you, listen, you got to toe the line. If you don't toe the line, we'll primary you, we'll deny you funding, we will make sure your bills don't get out of committee. So the leadership in the Republican Party is just as brutal as the leadership in the Democrat Party. And because when you look at leadership, you don't typically find conservatives there. You typically find opportunists and party operatives, not so much people with an ideological bent. So there's always a tension between the Freedom Caucus and in the U.S. House and House leadership. We saw this just now with Scott Perry from Pennsylvania, who just submitted bills to take out the Green New Deal projects now, not to wait for so many years or get them funded if they can turn a shovel of dirt. Take them out now. End the mandates now. That's something the entire Republican Party should be behind. That should be a bill out of committee on the floor and voted on tomorrow. But it won't be because leadership is not aligned with this Freedom Caucus. So I would say that in Pennsylvania, the Freedom Caucus has strong members that are really dedicated, good people who are ideological and who really are working to defend the interests of the country. And you could tell that because again, they get battered by the party from time to time. They sued over the governor taking what are really unconstitutional actions around elections blatantly, and the party resisted that and actually, chastised them and went after them for doing that. Now, why would the Republican Party not support the legislature filing litigation to compel the governor, the radical governor, to comply with the Pennsylvania Constitution? It's not logical. So I would say the Freedom Caucus here is still good. A couple of the members seem to have weakened a bit, again, as they see opportunity. But it's not growing at the pace it should. It's not speaking with the loud voice that it should. It really comes down to the citizens making a decision of either I'm going to get behind the issues this group is talking about, and when they have a bill pending, I'm going to pressure my leftists kind of Republican or corrupt leadership to support it, or they're just going to continue fighting, screaming into the wind and not having the loud voice they should have. So it's good. They've done great work. They're the only ones fighting, but their effectiveness is muted both by leadership and by the fact that in Pennsylvania, we not only have a radical governor, but we have radicals in control of the House. The Democrats seized control of the House a couple of years ago. And so good bills don't get through the House. We turn our attention then to the Senate, where we had at one point a 6-seat majority. That has been whittled down to about a 3-seat majority. So the Senate is good, but it's certainly not a Freedom Caucus Senate. They put bills through that are shocking. So I'm just saying, I guess the conclusion of that is we're sort of in trouble at the state level because citizens haven't been paying attention, and there's a tremendous amount of corruption, and the people in our state legislatures across the country are often not typically ideological. Quick example is Ohio. Ohio is a 3R state, Republican governor who just vetoed a bill to protect children in schools, a Republican House and a Republican Senate. And yet you don't hear about Ohio leading the nation in conservative values. You hear about Florida, you mentioned earlier. When do you ever hear about Ohio? You don't. Because the truth of the matter is the leadership there is much closer to a Democrat ideology than they are to a conservative, grassroots, sort of voter-based Republican ideology.
Yeah, I think I had a conversation with a former governor. I'll let people try to figure out which former governor of Mississippi. I had a long conversation, and he used this phrase 80-20. He said, you got to go in, try to get 80% of what you want. You're going to have to take 20% of what you don't want. And I just think that's kind of a defeatist attitude. I think if you just, I think I used to say there's two things that every politician fears, and that's losing an election or being held accountable in a public space. I think there's a third thing that they would really fear, and that's an educated public, which is why I think it's so important to start from the ground roots of dealing with our students, of getting them back into teaching civics into the schools. They teach civics in Florida. I did ask that specific question of Jenna when we were sitting on the board. I think that coupled with getting the information to the citizens and encouraging them to do things like exercising that First Amendment right to petition and seek redress. Now, you were talking about Roger Wicker. So the way that they protect Wicker here, and this is where I think it makes some in the establishment nervous when I start asking these questions, and now some of the people around me are asking these questions, which is when we haven't directly elected a senator since 1978. That was Thad Cochran was the last one that just ran and then ran for election and was elected. They've been appointed since then. And the way that works is they get, when Trent Lott stepped down, when he said, I'm going to retire, Roger Wicker finished out his last year and a half or 2 years of his term That gave him a 2-year head start on running for office because you're constantly running for office. And he was able to get in good with the donors, the political class, the military industrial complex, and he was building momentum. So what ends up happening then is anybody that's grassroots, you don't have a chance to compete against that because
Right.
you've got federal party leadership, state party leadership, you've got media in Mississippi, all coming after you if you try to just challenge this individual. That's why I've encouraged people like Gannon Burton, who ran against Roger Wicker and actually won Roger Wicker's home county, the people that are supposed to know Wicker the best. Gannon Burton, he got into the game late. He won that county. I said, if you're going to run against somebody like a Cindy Hyde Smith or Roger Wicker, you got to start a couple of years out. You don't start, you start going out and you got to build that momentum and name recognition. You can't worry about, am I going to hit the sweet spot? Am I going to burn out on media attention? You got to keep doing things like Ada did. Just keep pressing forward, be persistent, be consistent. Yeah. And what ends up happening is once they've vanquished that challenger, now you're faced with, do I vote for a Democrat or do I vote for a Republican? And most of the people in Mississippi, well, I'm not going to vote for a Democrat. It's going to take a little bit to overcome that. Now, on the representative level, the governor can't appoint a representative to finish out a term. So what ends up happening is when you have a representative here, and this is the way it is in Mississippi, and I'll be interested if this is what you see in Pennsylvania, that representative may decide, I'm not going to run again. I'm going to go ahead and retire from office at the end of my term. Well, they don't tell the public that right away.
Right.
They go ahead and tell the state party leaders, and then they go out and cultivate a candidate that as soon as the individual announces, somebody's already got momentum and they're moving forward, and it's hard to get somebody to overcome that. And then you're faced again with, do I vote for a Democrat or Republican? And people will either do one of two things. They're either going to vote for the Republican, or they're just not going to vote. And I think that most of the leadership is just okay with that. So is that similar to what you see up in Pennsylvania or in Ohio? I know you have some connections to Ohio.
So in Ohio, they had a state, or rather a U.S. representative who'd spent a lot of time in the military, had done a lot of work in the IT arena in the military, became an officer, and spent a lot of time with certain three-letter agencies. And when you see that,
familiar with those.
Yeah, when you see the IT and then the connection with the intelligence community, you know that there's a special relationship there, right? And so they took him out mid-term, handed him a $400,000 state university president job. Running a small university, just a great gig to pick up another, $500,000, or rather a couple $1 million before you retire. That opened up a U.S. representative seat. They put a guy in there who's actually pretty good, but that opened up his seat in the state legislature. So they moved somebody over from the House to the Senate. And what they did was a series of moves that suddenly had someone, instead of running as a state representative, running for Senate, potentially facing a primary, he was an incumbent and there's no primary. There was, instead of having potentially a primary for the U.S. representative position, there was a guy in that role. So he runs as an incumbent, and they're all endorsed before the campaign even begins. It's exactly what you're talking about. Now, they've been more successful with that in Ohio in this move. It was incredible. It was like a train going down the track, all the cars linked together. Everybody got a little promotion. Now, the gentleman that's in the state, in the U.S., that went from the state legislature to Congress, I think he's a pretty good representative. But some of the others are not particularly ideological. They're not particularly effective. They put up bills that are not important. Well, then that left a state rep position open. So the local party held an interview process and picked one and appointed him. He ran as an incumbent, and of course he won too. Now, he's a pretty ideological guy. I think he could end up being really good if the system doesn't get full control of him. We'll see how that goes. But there's the practice that you're talking about is happening across the nation, and then there's the other side of it where they can't do that. The party is now steadfast against any primary. They do not want the public to ever have a choice of a candidate. So in Pennsylvania, when the Senate seat was open, Dave McCormick put a lot of money into managing relationships with the state committee, dinners and events. He was at all those things. They endorsed him before the general election the year before. In other words, he was running in 24. They endorsed him late in 23, but before the 23 election. Took a lot of attention off the 23 candidates. But the point was they did not want to have a contested primary in the Senate in 2024. And they didn't. And now they're rolling that out everywhere. So the party right now is trying to consolidate the power, the cabal that does all of the endorsement work, right? That really decides who gets the endorsements in the way you described. Either they're incumbents, so they're automatically endorsed, or they're connected, so they get endorsed. They're doing everything they can to eliminate primaries at every level, local, statewide, at every level. They are trying to eliminate those primaries by doing endorsements and then forcing county committee members to only support endorsed candidates. Up until now, as a Republican committee member at the state or at a county committee, committee members were free to support any Republican in a primary. They couldn't support a Democrat. That would be a violation of the rules of being a Republican committee member, but they could support any Republican. So if there was an endorsed candidate, they could support the other one. If there was no endorsed candidate, they could support whichever one they want. They're trying to change those rules at the county level across Pennsylvania now, so that if there's an endorsement, the committee members are compelled to only talk about that endorsement. They'll say, well, you can tell people you support someone else, but you can't use palm cards. You can't wear their T-shirt. You can't talk about them at the polling place. You can't have their literature on the Republican table at a precinct. But sure, you're free to support anyone you want. But if you do any of those things, we will purge you from the party. And the party has acted in 23 and now in 25 to purge people from state committee and from county committees who supported a Republican in the primary who was not endorsed. So this is now about absolutely concentrating power. And they say, well, wait, the whole state committee votes on endorsements. Well, yeah, that's true. However, there is a rigorous whipping process whereby inducements are offered and people are threatened. In one group that was calling for, a rule change to help make the primary contested, was told that they should come to a state committee meeting at a time the state committee meeting wasn't being held. In other words, it started earlier. By the time they got there, everything was decided, but they had specifically sent emails to those members telling them to come later in the day. They missed the meeting. So there is a concerted effort here to lock in that power, eliminate primaries, centralize elections through mail-in ballots so that there's more and more power at the centralized level, and really do away with the ability of someone to come up out of the grassroots, build support within their community, and run for office and win.
Yeah, in Kentucky, if you remember, Mitch McConnell tried to get that codified in the state of Kentucky, that if when there was really a push for him to just go ahead and retire, that the party would end up choosing who the person would be, and not that the governor would have to appoint somebody that the party chose.
Yes.
And that's just antithetical to the way that our Constitution works. I hope that more citizens will start to recognize this stuff. I think they need people like you, me, Ada, some of my other friends that we've been getting together to actually start speaking up.
Yeah.
And hopefully our voices will carry the day. There's nothing really. I mean, I don't say that there's nothing. I'm sure they'd figure out something. There's nothing really the state party could do to me other than if I tried to run, they might make it very difficult. But I think I've figured a way around that. And I think that's what terrifies them. The reason I think that they were nervous about that is I start having some people that are connected with the state party asking me things like, hey, are you going to be at the luncheon on Wednesday? They're kind of curious if I'm going to be there, or are you going to be at this breakfast, or, this, whatever, this other event. And I always tell them I'm going to be there because I hope that by doing so, it causes some of the people that I haven't been able to have a follow-up conversation with, like a Roger Wicker, to not show up. So if I can keep him off the stage just by the mere idea that I might show up. Now, real quick, let's talk about Texas. I, I'm still kind of kicking around about how the federal government, the FBI, is going to help out with this, providing some assistance. There is a way to do some law enforcement assistance. There's a way that the FBI can provide some of their assets to help out on state things. I don't think that the FBI can actually go out and arrest these individuals. It would be a stretch. And I was talking to my brother-in-law, our producer here, who's an attorney, about whether or not they could use 18 USC 241 and 242 dealing with civil rights and color law with the
Uh-huh.
violation of their oath by not representing. I think they might be able to use that as a way to provide assistance. I don't know if they can overtly do anything. I would encourage the citizens, if your state representatives are leaving the state and not representing you, in other words, not purposely not doing their job, it's great that somebody thinks, well, we can go after bribery with the people that are paying money for them to be able to leave the state. I would recommend what we did with the school board. Go after their surety bonds. Just file a claim against it. If enough people get together and file those claims, the insurance adjuster that holds those bonds is going to have to look into it. There has to be an investigation. I would think that that would be a way to get them back in. I don't know how, and I haven't looked at Texas law. I don't know how the governor or the attorney general is going to be able to vacate their positions or just pull them out of office. That seems. I think the threat of that's there, but I would encourage them to go after their surety bonds. I think that would get their attention because if they can't be bonded, they can't be in office. I mean, that's just a simple fact. I don't think enough people know about that. What are your thoughts on these individuals? And I know Republicans have done it too.
Oh
I
yeah.
had some complaints in Alabama years and years, decades ago, where some Republicans were refusing to come in and engage in a quorum. What are your thoughts on what's going on over in Texas?
Well, look, there's something that's been happening in Texas over these last couple of years as Texans have become more active, the Texas people, right? You remember when they went after Ken Paxton? We talked about this before, and suddenly state representatives were being taken out of office in the primary because the activists who were real conservative, moderate Americans went into what got involved in their committees and they found primary contesters and took these guys out because they were obviously working against their voters, working for the corrupt cabal that controls the Republican Party there and going after Ken Paxton to stop his agenda, which was their agenda. It's a perfect example of the people sort of rising up, getting involved and changing the outcome. So the battle between the Republican, that Republican that's really close to the Democrats, the corrupt ones, the establishment folks, and the voters in Texas has been kind of raging. This to me is great because the fact that these people had to run and that now there's this question being asked about why are they running, hopefully that gets more of the public to start paying attention to what's happening at the state level. I don't think that the average American understands that apportionment for congressional districts is based on citizens of foreign countries who happen to be in your state. I don't think they understand that a lot of California's representation is based on the fact that they have a lot of people in that state who aren't citizens of the United States. And I don't think any common sense American would accept the argument that we should be giving representation to citizens of foreign countries. It makes no sense. All right, they're here legally or illegally. Why would we give foreign people representation in Congress? You're here on vacation from France, you get a congressman? This is silliness. So I actually like the fact that this has happened and it's going to raise attention and get people to pay more attention to what's going on. I don't know how this could work out either. I've looked at it and said, is it a crime to not show up to work? Well, in other states, they've tried to cut their income, they've taken away their payments and things like that, and that hasn't always worked. Maybe it's worked sometimes. I don't know how this really pans out. That these folks that their seats are vacated. I think it's going to end up being a very long legal fight, but I'm just glad it's happening. And the fact that now Texas is beginning to move so far forward that Democrats are having to leave the state because Texas is finally getting aggressive. That's a great thing. That in the Texas legislature, The Republicans often appoint chairs to committees who are Democrats, even though they have no reason to do that. And they talk about trying to be, inclusive or whatever. No, you're appointing radicals to chairmanships that determine what legislation gets to the floor of the Texas legislature. Why would you do that? Well, you do that because ideologically, those leaders were closer aligned to the Democrats than they were to their own voters. So what's happening in Texas, I hope, is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen in states like Pennsylvania and other states where the voters don't really understand that their Republican conservative representation isn't conservative at all and isn't really representing their agenda.
Yeah, I think I always believe sunlight's the best disinfectant, and I think bringing these things out into the sunlight where they're seeing the actions of these individuals and asking questions. It was something that we were trying to do during all of the COVID overreach. I was probably one of the few people, and I like Tate Reeves as our governor. I genuinely like him as a person. I've had a number of conversations with him, but he overstepped his constitutional bounds during the COVID stuff. And I started calling it out. And the only way that I could counter it was just to say, I'm just not going to comply. We're going to see where this goes. I'm going to decide under my constitutional rights who I associate with, that where I go, that what I say, that freely engaging in commerce, those types of things. And I did it, and I didn't face any backlash. I didn't have anybody's, coming after me. I had already talked to state and local law enforcement about what are you going to do when I do this, because I'm going to do this. And they said, we don't have a statute or an ordinance or anything to enforce that we can do this. As long as you're not violating the law, we don't enforce executive orders. And I think that there were a lot of, I would say, squishy Republicans that kind of leaned into, oh my God, we've got this virus coming in. Let's suspend some constitutional rights for a short period of time. You and I are old enough to know that when the government borrows some of your constitutional rights and takes them away, they're reluctant to give them back.
Yeah, it turns
because
out
that is power. Speaking on that topic, I'm probably one of the few people in my circle, and I've had this conversation with some fellow retired FBI agents. I think it's time for the Patriot Act to go away. When it was put into place to help us when I was with the FBI to be able to quickly act on things, to be able to go out and use letters to say we're going to go to the court, we're going to get this. In the meantime, we need you to do this. The issues that I have with it is I think it's worn out its usefulness. And I was in the FBI pre-Patriot Act and I was in the FBI post-Patriot Act. There's nothing that happens with the Patriot Act that just some good hard investigative work and prosecutorial work that it couldn't be done before the Patriot Act. It just expedited some of the tools that they had. And I'm one of those that I think it's got to go away. I also think that the FISA process is the way that we had a short period of time where the malfeasance was brought out, where they showed that 98% of all FISA applications were approved through the court. And then we find out, going back and re-examining those things, that a significant number of those were not justified. They weren't, the affidavits didn't support it, but we never saw any recourse after that. It's almost like it just went away. And I think there should be some accountability. If I was a judge and I signed off on FISA applications that Jim Comey had put forth, and Jim Comey is ultimately responsible for that. When you sign off on that, you're saying everything that's in this package, I know to be a fact. Yep. Either I've talked to somebody about it, I've read through it, I understand it. There's something that a lot of people don't know about. It's called a Woods file, where every line of that affidavit has to be justified. He is certifying, swearing to an oath that is true. Well, when it turns out not to be true, where's the accountability? Kevin Kleinsmith, the one that altered information in a FISA that violated the Fourth Amendment rights of Carter Page, the only accountability he got was like a slap on the wrist of about 6 months, and he's practicing law again up in DC, probably making millions of dollars. There was no accountability. And I
No.
didn't hear anybody from the Republican side saying, no, we've got to make an example of this. The Constitution was just violated. That's why when I ask those questions, the most difficult question that I asked my congressman, and I talked to people on his staff, and this is the thing that kept him up at night, was when I said, can you tell me of a time when you observed that a citizen's rights were violated under the Constitution? What acts did you take, and what was the results of that? And he could not answer the question. I don't think it's a priority of many or most of our representatives, and it's literally the one thing that they swear an oath to do. So
That's right.
I don't understand that. I think that there has to be action. I don't want us to move beyond the overreach that happened during COVID. There still needs to be accountability. That last portion, what are your thoughts on that? On reining in some of these overreaching powers through the Patriot Act and such, and the FISA courts with the federal government.
Well, it's not just the people that are putting in false affidavits. It's also the prosecuting attorneys, or as I call them, the persecuting attorneys. You think about these DAs that go out and file these claims that are absolutely false, and they prosecute them with the full force of the government. So they've got all their resources, unlimited amounts of time, investigators. They tear people's lives apart with no justification. And then it's found out that there was, in fact, no justification, that these were politically motivated or based on some personal beef or whatever the cause. What happens to those folks? Nothing. They're free to use all of the government resources for their personal political or personal agenda and face no consequences whatsoever. And it's the same with these affidavits. Now, when I was, I remember being in a board meeting with a bunch of very smart people when the Patriot Act came out, and we started talking about it. And I said, I don't think this is a good thing. We should not be allowing this. This is going to set aside the Constitution. And there were a lot of these conversations that I had, but I remember one specific conversation with a very smart man, very wealthy. And he just looked at me and said, I'm terrified after 9/11. I don't care what the government does. I have nothing to hide. They can surveil me all they want. They have to protect us from having another 9/11. And I thought, wow, all right, hold on there, Skippy. This guy clearly had no understanding of the importance of his constitutionally protected rights, or how this system that made him so wealthy was created and preserved. And it was exactly that attitude that led to this Patriot Act and RICO before it becoming a major effort to just completely set aside the Constitution. I struggle with this still today to just accept that people are so easily willing to throw away what so many in the Revolutionary War died for. The risks that those people took to give us this extraordinary world, and then we just give it away because of 9/11. Now, look, I don't mean to minimize 9/11. I think there are a lot of questions around 9/11 that we need to have answers for, but they always say, I can't remember exactly the phrase, but I'm sure you remember it. Those who are willing to give up their freedom for security will have neither. And look where we are. So I think you're right, and that FISA court should go away. When you've got a 98% success in getting these, and there's never a repercussion for doing something that is wrong in there, for submitting false evidence, as Kleinsmith did, I'm sure that he's having a great career in repayment for what he did. Meanwhile, there are other attorneys who did things like file cases questioning election integrity, challenging, demanding access to public records so that elections could be verified. And they've lost, or are in the process of losing still today, their bar license, their license to practice law. So in other words, Kleinsmith goes out and clearly does something that should have him disbarred and likely in prison. Not a problem. But if you're actually representing the interests of the people, trying to strengthen and protect our election system, you're going to be disbarred. You may remember Project 65, I think it was called, where the globalists and the leftists raised $65 million, I think might have been the reason, or the basis for the name. But they raised a huge amount of money, 60, 70 million. And they used that money specifically to go around and make sure that no election fraud cases made it to court, that they were rejected on lack of standing, which was ludicrous on its face, but worked. And they also set about making certain that any attorney that took such a case would be disbarred. Now, it didn't work universally. There's still some attorneys that aren't being disbarred who took some of those cases, but they took a lot of attorneys out and ruined their careers, took away their ability to practice, tied them up for years in litigation or ethics complaints. Uh, it's a system that is so deeply corrupted. One of the things I think that Donald Trump did that was genius was getting the American Bar Association recommendation removed from consideration in paneling judges. Look at all these radical lunatics that we have as judges, these activists in robes. Every one of them had an ABA recommendation. The American Bar Association was considered. Was it waving its arms saying, hold on, this person isn't qualified. This person is a radical activist. This person will let their ideology overrule their legal obligation or their obligation to the Constitution. No, they supported that. So Trump taking the ABA, the American Bar Association, out of consideration in judges is smart. But that doesn't fix the core problem you're pointing out, which is that if you are a government official who uses the full weight of the government against citizens unjustly, the odds are, as long as you're a leftist, a globalist, you'll face no consequences.
Yeah, on the court thing, and I keep toying around with this article that I keep threatening to write, and I have some attorney friends that my brother-in-law is not one of those that kind of counters me on this, but I've got some other attorney friends where I said, the Constitution doesn't require you to have ever been a judge or an attorney to sit on the U.S. Supreme Court. Maybe it's time to do what the founders intended, which is have a person of good common sense on the Supreme Court that doesn't have that background. It's that people keep tying into thinking just because you're an attorney that you're some constitutional scholar and expert.
Oh,
I
oh
just
yeah.
talked to, yeah, I just talked to a kid that at one of our adult soccer league uh, championship the other night, and he just took the bar. And I was asking him what was on, what was the bar like and all of that. And such a small amount of it dealt with constitutional law. And I said, everything's based on the Constitution. It really should start from there. If you
Yeah.
don't have a full understanding of that, how do you call into question when when other laws are passed? Uh, ending here before we have to get off. That FISA court process, one of the things that it does is it delays notification. So when the federal government goes to a court, or the state and local government the federal government goes to a court,
Mm-hmm.
and they seek to permission to usurp your Fourth Amendment rights, the you have a right to know that the government has looked into your bank accounts, that the government has looked into your emails, that the government has searched your house.
Yes.
There is a delayed notification clause in there that can be delayed for a very long time. And I hear a couple of people that were posting, they got these notification letters that, 5 years ago or 4 years ago that the government looked into their email or their bank account. They were officially notified. And now you're having to fight to go, what were you looking at my bank account about? At some point, you have to notify them. Now, that's another reason why I think that needs to go away. I
Yeah.
mean, granted, you do want to have that element of surprise. So if you're going to work against the mafia, and you're going to start looking at bank accounts, you don't want to give them a heads up of which investigative path that you're taking.
Right.
But you shouldn't be able to delay that notification for over a decade. And there are cases where it's been over a decade, especially if it's dealing with the foreign intelligence threats.
Mm-hmm.
So, Gary, what are some successes that you're seeing in Pennsylvania? Like I told you here, one of the successes that we had with the school board was threatening their surety bonds. The other successes I'm seeing is I'm starting to see more citizens get engaged and ask civil and cogent questions of their representatives and challenging them on the topics, and also challenging some of the people in the media that don't ask those challenging questions. Why didn't you ask this? What are some successes that you're seeing up in Pennsylvania?
Well, let me just jump back to one thing and give you a quick story
Sure.
on related to this constitutional issue. Right, I was at the Constitution Center in Philadelphia, which is a wonderful place to go. Constitution Hall's down there. Just looking at the building makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up when you think about what these people achieved in creating this new nation, right? I mean, it was just it's astonishing. So I was down there with someone who had just graduated from law school at Georgetown, and we started speaking about her hero, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, we got into this conversation not very deep, but she started explaining how, the Constitution's a living document. The justices have to interpret it in light of what they know about modern life and their own political views. And so I just asked her, I said, well, if the justices are free to use the bench to implement their own views and really set aside the intentions of the founders and look at this Constitution as nothing more than a fluid set of ideas, what is the check on their power? What is the check on Ruth Bader Ginsburg's power if she's free to exercise her ideology from the bench? This woman went silent, and that's the last substantive conversation we had. I'm talking to someone who just came out of Georgetown law, and a simple question about judicial philosophy ends the conversation. We are in deep trouble because our law schools are teaching these students, and specifically Georgetown, Harvard, Yale, that this Constitution is just a floating thing, and it really is up to us, the smart, current day people who know a lot more than those founders. It's up to us to interpret what it means, and that may mean that now we have the concept of hate speech, which we will get to define what hate speech is, and we will decide who can speak and who has to go to jail for saying something we don't like. That is precisely what's happening in most of Western civilization. Canada puts people in jail for speech. The UK puts people in jail for speech all the time. So this destruction of the constitutional protections of our rights is coming from the law schools into the judiciary, and it's been doing it for a very long time. That must get reversed. And I think some of what Donald Trump is doing in confronting these radical lunatics that run the universities, I think that's a critical element in beginning to turn that around, so that when a lawyer comes out of law school, they think of the Constitution rather than a floating object in a sea of ideas. They think of it as an anchor that holds this nation in place. So in terms of wins we're having up here, after the 2020 election, there was a massive upsurge in interest and activism. And we had large numbers of people begin going to meetings and get educated and reading and communicating amongst themselves, and going to county commissioner meetings, going to election board meetings, going in many cases to township meetings, school board meetings. And they began to understand just how corrupt, just how ideologically, radical these elected officials were, and what they were rolling out in government, and how much money is just flushing through this system with no real transparency. That resulted in a large number of wins. Litigation got some of the election processes changed that made it possible for Trump to win. Projects were run here that got citizens who moved out of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to send letters to their former board of elections in the county they lived in and say, "Hey, I don't live there anymore. Remove me from the rolls." Well, there are lots of arguments about cleaning up the voter rolls, but it is crystal clear that clean voter rolls are harder to use to cheat. We've had groups that went out and did canvassing and proved that mail-in ballots and in-person voting has been done by people who are not living here. In other words, you will find at some precincts that magically someone who's moved to Texas 4 or 5 years ago will vote here on election day. Well, once you find that and expose it, it makes it harder and harder for the election fraud to continue. So one of the great success stories of the activist community in Pennsylvania is that they built the foundation that Donald Trump stood on when he ran that brilliant campaign and won this state. There have been fewer successes at school boards. We've not seen great success in getting school board candidates elected. Occasionally one gets in who's really a parent dedicated to protecting children and then hopefully educating children would be a nice thing to bring back into the schools. But those wins have been few and far between. Now I'm speaking of Southeast Pennsylvania, the 5 counties that make up about a third of the state's population, about 45% of its GDP, that has been really over a period of, say, 16, 17, 18, 19, absolutely overrun by radicals who now control the counties, they control the vast majority of school boards, they control most of the townships. Um, so from an activist standpoint, there have been a lot of victories. From a political standpoint of actually changing the ideology or changing the composition of school boards and county commissioners to those that will execute the job in the interest of the citizens, that hasn't been very successful. And
Well,
the
I'm
reason,
sorry.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
The
No,
reason,
I mean, I'm sorry to hear that. I haven't been to a school board meeting in a while here, since we technically won the battle over the COVID stuff. I do need to check back in on the books in the library. The last conversation that I had, and it's just a different, I guess it's a different lay of the land down here, down in the Bible Belt. So the last thing that I said to the school board when I stood in front of them about the obscene and pornographic material in the schools was I said, listen, I'm not going to ask you why you're so reluctant to remove this stuff from the schools. I'm going to ask you, why'd you think it was important enough for it to be there in the first place? And you may not answer that question. I may ask you out in public. You may not answer when people ask you at church, when they bump into you on the street. Heck, you're not answering the question here. And they do that 5-minute thing where they won't even respond to what you're saying, but they do give you your 5 minutes to say something. And I said, you know what? You don't have to answer me. You don't have to answer the public. You don't have to answer other politicians. But one day, you're going to answer. You're going to bend that knee. And I said, he's going to ask you about it. And he's going to say, tell me about this. You're going to answer that question. You don't have the opportunity to say no to that. So,
right.
You figure out how you want to live your life down here. And let's see what happened when he, capital He, asked you about that. Well, Gary, I hate to cut it short. We could go on for at least another
Sure.
hour. I
Yeah,
appreciate
we
you
could.
last minute coming in here. Give my best to Ada.
Will do.
I hope that I got to get her on the podcast here. I just want people to actually hear her voice. She's supposed to be coming back on the Conservative Voice here soon, isn't she?
We're expecting to have her back sometime in the next few weeks, so stay tuned. I'm sure she'll be back at it soon. I do believe she's going to drop another piece on Substack today and a
Uh-huh.
thread in on X. I haven't checked; it may be out now, but stay tuned. She's doing great work.
Well, President Trump seems to think she's doing great work, and
That's right.
I hope that we keep highlighting that. Gary, thank you again for coming on. Give my best to Ada. I do tune in. I did tune in this past Thursday. Congrats on getting Victor Davis Hanson on there. I am
Oh, it's
going to
great.
take Christine's recommendations. I'm just going to be persistent in going back and forth in emails with his handler. I'd love to get him on here just to talk U.S. history and the Constitution. Is just something
Uh,
I'm really, really passionate about.
it is a different thing to talk to him. It was quite exciting, and we had a great episode yesterday, Friday. Yesterday, of course, we're on Friday 12 to 2, and what we got into was some of these specifics around party politics. We talked about Tennessee, and of course, we talked about Pennsylvania, and it was interesting to watch a thread that ran through the entire show, quite naturally, not structured, not planned, where in every instance we were talking about the World Health Organization, the UN, and the World Economic Forum. We were talking about economics. And in each of these segments, the discussion with the guest came back to Republicans in Congress have to get to work and implement the American agenda. And I think that's where we all collectively have to begin to really focus our efforts, is forcing these, fake conservatives, opportunists, forcing them to get in line with the real conservatives who are really representing Republican, conservative, grassroots interests and philosophies. We got to force them to go and implement this American agenda. But thank you for having me on, and it's always fun to connect. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Gary. I appreciate it, and we'll talk to you next time. All right, Mr. Producer, let's come back to me, and I'll do some parting thoughts here. So I mentioned that I had the opportunity to go down to Florida and sit on that panel. I do recommend that you follow Jenna Persons Malika. She was amazing down there. They've got great representation down in Florida. They are leading the way among the states. And Just something, and it's not advertising here, and it's not technically political. If you'll pull up, Mr. Producer, I've got this little flyer here. There is a soft opening of a club, of an entertainment venue over in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. They're not a sponsor here, but my best friend Mark of 50 years, his son is a social media influencer. I highly recommend you follow him out there. Like, he needs my help. He's got millions of followers. At 21 years old, to have millions of followers and the kind of money that he's making right now off of social media. But he and another friend of mine that is politically connected, and I'm not gonna mention his name here right now. You might be able to figure out if you follow Tyler Hearing, Hearing. Tyler is on every outlet that's out there. His primary venue is Snapchat, but he's also on TikTok and Instagram. I think he's got an account on X, but he has a wide reach. He and my other friend and another guy have gone in and they purchased what used to be Druid City Music Hall at the University of Alabama. It's right there on the strip. I mean, you can walk to the stadium from this location. They're going to have the soft open, so I'm planning on heading over to Tuscaloosa this weekend to pop into there. And Dexter Roberts is going to be the entertainment. He's from Fayette, Alabama. I think he placed seventh on American Idol. So he's going to entertain. This is just for family and friends. So this is kind of an invite only thing. The week after that, they'll have their full opening, and they've got a country music star that's going to be in there. It's an amazing venue. I've been over there as my friend Mark, who's in construction and home building in the building industry, has been renovating this place, and it is an amazing venue. It's really going to be good during football season because they've got like a 40-foot screen in there where you can actually go in and almost feel like you're in the stadium watching this. So I encourage you, if you are in Tuscaloosa, if you're coming over for football games, take the time to go to Two Dimes. It's located right there on University Boulevard, within walking distance of the stadium. There's a Waffle House next door. So if you get in there and have a lot of fun, Waffle House is open 24 hours. Grab you a bite to eat afterward. But it's a great venue. I look forward to going over in meeting with some people, hearing this Dexter Roberts sing. I may know him. My wife is from Fayette, Alabama. So I'm betting over the decades that I've spent in Fayette, Alabama, we've probably crossed paths. So I look forward to seeing that. Mr. Producer, you can come back to me and I'll say my final goodbyes. So it was a really interesting conversation with Gary. I encourage you, citizens, to get out there and exercise that First Amendment right to petition and seek redress. It's one of the things that I left off with down in Florida. Citizens, you are smarter than any of the politicians give you credit for. They're there to represent you. And if you don't stand up and exercise that First Amendment right and ask them, what are they doing or what are they not doing? They're going to continue to go off on their own agenda. They're not up there to focus on their agenda. And they may use it, well, look at what I ran on. And you elected me to run on those things that I campaigned on. Well, not everything that somebody runs on in a campaign am I supportive of, but you are there to represent the citizens. So take note when they're not holding town halls, when you don't have access to them, when they're not returning calls when you call their office, or if you call their office, you only get to talk to staffers. You never get an opportunity to meet with and converse with those representatives. Take note of that because they are not adequately representing you. But the more educated you are on these topics, the better equipped you are when you do have those opportunities to speak with them, to challenge them on their actions and inactions. Well, thanks again for tuning in on the Blunt Force Conservative podcast. If you're going to catch me on Monday, I will be on Chris Salcedo of Newsmax. He has a radio show out of Texas, KSEV. We'll be on the air with him at, I believe it's going to be either 7 or 8 o'clock Central Time. I'll have to go back and look. I'll post something on there, but Chris has invited myself and John Nance, fellow retired FBI agent who's a columnist for townhall.com, to come on and talk about some of the events going on with the FBI, some other things going on with government. Chris Salcedo has become a good friend of mine, and he sent a text out asking if John and I would pop on the radio with him on Monday. So beginning at 8 a.m. Eastern, You can go to ksev.com and look for Chris Salcedo's show and click on that. You'll get to hear us, get to call in and maybe pose some questions. But we look forward to seeing you next time on the Blunt Force Conservative Podcast. Thank you for listening.